A trader sends a message: if you move the rate up today, I will buy you a bottle of champagne. The rate moves up. $350 trillion of financial contracts repriced by one message on one morning. This is how LIBOR was manipulated. Every mortgage you have ever had was priced against it, and every student loan and every corporate bond and every credit card and every interest rate swap in the world, and it sat at the center of $350 trillion worth of financial contracts, and it was called LIBOR, the London Interbank Offered Rate, and it was the most important number in global finance, and it was supposed to represent the rate at which banks lent money to each other, a genuine reflection of market conditions. And between 2003 and 2012, the traders at some of the largest banks in the world were simply making it up, submitting whatever number benefited their trading positions that day, and the people who paid the price were the ordinary borrowers whose mortgage payments and loan repayments were calculated using a number that had been quietly manipulated by traders sending each other messages like, if you can move the rate up today, I will buy you a bottle of champagne. LIBOR stood for London Interbank Offered Rate, and it had been created in the 1980s as a standardized reference rate that banks could use to price the enormous variety of financial products that referenced a floating interest rate, and the mechanism was simple. Every day a panel of major banks would submit the rate at which they could borrow money in the interbank market, and those submissions would be averaged, and the result would be LIBOR for that day for that currency and that tenor, and the rate would then be used to calculate payments on hundreds of trillions of dollars worth of contracts around the world. The problem with this mechanism was that it relied entirely on the honesty of the banks making the submissions, and there was no independent verification of whether the submitted rates reflected actual transactions, and the banks submitting the rates employed traders who had enormous financial interests in where LIBOR was set on any given day, because those same traders held positions in derivatives and swaps and bonds that paid out more or less depending on whether LIBOR was a fraction of a basis point higher or lower, and the conflict of interest was built into the design, and for years nobody asked whether it was being exploited. The answer, as investigations starting in 2008 would reveal, was that it had been exploited systematically and enthusiastically for years, and the manipulation took two distinct forms, and the first was traders at individual banks requesting that their bank's rate submitters adjust their submissions to benefit the trader's book. A trader who stood to profit if LIBOR was higher on a particular day would contact the rate setter at his own bank and ask for a high submission. A trader who stood to profit from a lower rate would ask for a low submission, and the messages documenting these requests were extraordinarily casual, traders asking for favors with the same tone they might use to request a coffee, sometimes offering gifts, sometimes just assuming it would be done as a matter of course. The second form of manipulation was collusion between traders at different banks, traders at Barclays and Deutsche Bank and UBS and Citigroup and others messaging each other to coordinate their submissions, to move LIBOR collectively in a direction that benefited their shared positions. And this was more serious because it was not just a conflict of interest within a single institution. It was active coordination across competing institutions to rig what was supposed to be an objective market rate. Tom Hayes was a derivatives trader at UBS and later Citigroup who became the central figure in the LIBOR scandal, and Hayes was by all accounts extraordinarily talented at his job. A gifted mathematical mind who constructed some of the most complex interest rate derivative trades in the market. But he had also built an elaborate network of contacts at multiple banks and brokers whom he pressured and incentivized to adjust LIBOR submissions in directions that benefited his positions, and Hayes was not subtle about this, and the documentary evidence of his requests ran to thousands of messages, and when investigators began examining the evidence, the scale of his activity was remarkable, not because Hayes was uniquely corrupt, but because the culture around him had normalized the manipulation to the point that it barely felt wrong. When the investigation became public in 2012, the fines were extraordinary, and Barclays paid $290 million to settle charges, and UBS paid $1.5 billion, and Royal Bank of Scotland paid $612 million, and Deutsche Bank paid $2.5 billion, and Citigroup paid $925 million, and HSBC paid $618 million, and the total fines across all institutions eventually exceeded $9 billion, and the scale of the settlement amounts reflected not just the severity of the conduct but the number of years over which it had occurred and the number of institutions involved. Tom Hayes was arrested in December 2012 and charged with conspiracy to defraud, and in August 2015, following a 9-week trial, he was convicted on 8 counts of conspiracy to defraud and sentenced to 14 years in prison, a sentence that was subsequently reduced to 11 years on appeal. Hayes became the first individual to be convicted and imprisoned for LIBOR manipulation in the United Kingdom, and his conviction triggered a wave of prosecutions across multiple jurisdictions, though the results were mixed, with some subsequent cases resulting in acquittals and others in convictions. The LIBOR benchmark itself was subsequently reformed and a new mechanism requiring submissions to be backed by actual transactions rather than estimates was introduced, and the transition away from LIBOR toward new risk-free reference rates was completed in most currencies by 2023, and the rate that had underpinned $350 trillion of financial contracts for decades was retired. So what is the real lesson of LIBOR? And the lesson has two layers, and the first layer is about the specific conduct that traders at major banks treated a benchmark that affected hundreds of millions of ordinary borrowers around the world as a personal profit mechanism, and the casual way in which it was done, the champagne requests and the cheerful messages, suggest that the culture that enabled it was one in which the connection between what happened on a trading floor and the effect it had on ordinary people had been almost entirely severed. And the second layer is about design. A benchmark that underpinned $350 trillion of financial contracts was allowed to operate for decades with a submission mechanism that created massive conflicts of interest and no verification. And the question that the LIBOR scandal raises is not just about the traders who exploited the design. It is about the regulators and bank executives who allowed the design to persist long after the incentives to manipulate it were obvious to anyone who looked. That is the capital case. Subscribe to the capital case because the next case is already waiting.